how we draw flows from how we think, and that's why we should never rush to start a drawing too quickly. And normally, I would emphasize the importance, particularly when drawing from a photo, of visualizing the three-dimensionality of our scene, because a photo has made the three-dimensional two dimensions. If I'm standing here at the top of this steep flight of stairs in Sydney's Rocks region, then I'm very aware that this is almost like a long tunnel going downwards. I'm aware of the shapes around me, the ones that come towards me, go away from me. I'm aware of deep penetrations of tunnels that we have in several places and so forth. But when I look at a photo, it's flat, it's two dimensions. What we see are shapes, which is the word I associate with two-dimensional emphasis, instead of form, which I associate with three-dimensional emphasis. So in life, we're very aware of the forms. We're very aware of shapes that move up and down and away from us or come towards us. But with a photo, we see shapes. Now, the problem, therefore, when I draw from a photo is if I'm not thinking, if I'm not trying to put the three-dimensional understanding back into my scene, I'm going to start to draw shapes. And that can mean my drawing ends up looking very flat. And if you feel that your drawings lack depth, it's probably coming from an overemphasis in your observation on the shapes that we have in our flat photograph, rather than trying to see the three-dimensional form first and foremost. However, having seen through the two dimensions and seen the three dimensions of this photo, and it helps for me because I stood there and took this photo, so I'm very aware of this long, steep staircase going down. If we imagine the three dimensions and we get a feel for what's closer, what's further away, so that we can try and find marks when we draw to put this three-dimensional effect back into the scene, because I am drawing on paper, which is also two dimensions. So that's going to make it easier to just do a flat two-dimensional drawing. What I need to do is to imagine the three dimensions and try to find marks that create that feel of distance, of depth, of moving away or coming closer. But in order to do that accurately, sometimes, such as in a scene such as this, which is a complex scene, once we've seen and understood, we've perceived the three dimensions, it's actually to our advantage now to go back to looking at the two dimensions. Because in many ways, this quite complex scene is actually a tangle of, well, not really a tangle, but it's like a jigsaw puzzle of shapes. So if I forget that there's any three dimensions, I've got these roughly triangular shapes on the left-hand side. And, triangles are shapes that aren't that hard to copy, really. They have a base and they have two sides, and there are certain angles in each of the three corners. The same for the slightly chopped off triangles below it, the brick wall, and then the facing of the downward slope of the stairs which hold the railing on it. If I look on the right-hand side of the stairway, it's not so much that we have triangles as we have rectangular shapes. We have trapezoids, I think they are, of various shapes, and so forth. And we don't have a huge amount of, if you like, detail. We have the balusters, the upright posts in the balustrade, about midway in our scene, and we have this lamppost on the left-hand side. And we have then, of course, the foliage further back. But generally, we have a lot of shapes. So if I see this as in my mind, when I'm positioning where the different parts on my paper will be of this scene, if I think two-dimensional shape, to do my positioning, to get my marks or my initial lines, and then I can develop that with a focus on 3 dimensions, on creating the feel of closeness, of further away. I think that gives me a good chance of much more accuracy if I'm drawing this freehand in ink as I am here. So I don't have any pencil underdrawing, or I'm not using pencil that I'm planning to erase later. Instead, I'm looking at my reference, or I could have been looking at what was in front of me, and I'm seeking to draw what I see. If I were drawing this on location, even more important for me to really focus on the shapes and not the form while I position the main elements in this scene. Because in life, the sense of distance, the sense of the stairs going down a long way away from me is very, very strong. It's quite a dramatic spot to stand in because it's so steep and it goes down and it's got these 2 sides, and it also goes up and then across the road. So it's quite a powerful spot visually to stand in. And when I draw on location, the visual intensity can distract me and cause me to overemphasize it and to start to distort the actual shapes that this view presents to me. And as an aside, while we're talking of distortion, because cameras do distort the view that we have compared to life, I've chosen when I draw this to take that lean that's on the post at the top of the stairs on the right-hand side and to straighten it up more, because that's a lens distortion issue. It's not connected with the perspective that I get this close to that post. And that's just a personal issue. Sometimes I correct this lens distortion, and sometimes if I think it makes for a visually a more interesting scene, I leave it in. But in this case, I thought having vertical uprights all the way down was going to work better. And this is a good stage of the drawing to have a look at the shapes that I've created and compare them with the shapes in the reference. And some of them are better than others. I think if we look at the horizontal shapes that I've drawn above that archway where the pathway goes down onto the roadway, in the reference those shapes look a bit longer and thinner, although I think I may yet have to draw a little detail. No, actually I've already drawn that. So yeah, and these are good to know, and it may be I can possibly add a few lines later on to narrow that roughly rectangular shape or not. But it's always good to pay attention to what we've done, even if we're not going to be in a position to change it, because if I'm a little bit out there, that means I'll be a little bit out somewhere else, and perhaps in those somewhere else places that I haven't inked in yet, I can make some adjustments to spread the inaccuracy over possibly a larger area or more shapes, and therefore lessen the impact in any one place. So it's always good to be evaluating what we've drawn as we draw it, because that positions our strategizing to make the best choices with what we haven't yet drawn. And also, it gives us more information perhaps as to how we naturally draw, or the sorts of mistakes we're likely to make when we draw, that we can have as a warning in the back of our head next time we're doing a scene that requires similar skills. So for all those reasons, it's good to pay attention to what we're doing and what's not worked out, because the drawing ain't finished till it's finished. And there are always, not always, but in my experience, there are frequently more possibilities to correct things that aren't quite right before the end of the drawing than we imagine. So never get too worked up at the time. A mistake always feels absolute worst immediately you recognize that you've made it. But in life, it's very seldom that bad, at the end. And we usually notice things that aren't quite right more at the start when there is less in our drawing. And that's understandable. But when we add more detail, when we put other visually dramatic elements in besides what are still in effect outlining shapes, these mistakes often disappear dramatically. And you're actually watching me draw this at double speed. So this drawing took me an hour to do, and that's including the sketch marker that I use. I'm not really going to hatch in this drawing. I'm going to use ink of various values to create the light and dark effects. And so that is part of this video. So if you'd like to watch me at real time, you can use the cog icon to to slow this down, this video down to half time. My voice might drop an octave or so, but in that case you'll see it at actual speed. You can see the way I used my pen to check angles. I'll often put a small dot or a mark where I think one line angles up to or down to, or sometimes, as in this case, particularly if they're short lines and not significant in some ways to the overall accuracy, I'll just eyeball them and then check after the event. Now I should have in fact put this leafy silhouette edge in place before I drew those horizontal lines, because then I could have had it come out from the wall adequately. But I don't like having lines behind lines, so I had to amend what I was doing. So now we have some architectural detail on the far side of the road that this lower archway at the foot of the stairs lets us cross on foot. And one of the annoying things I've done here, and this is a mistake I tend to make. I often talk about how we tend to make the same type of mistakes when we draw. And what I've done here, and perhaps you can see it yourself already, is I'm simply drawing this detail too large in proportion to what I've already drawn. This decorative obelisk on the other side of the bridge is simply too large. And possibly if I'd switched to a thinner pen, that would have helped me draw it smaller, because the pen width, the width of the ink line or mark that we make, can have a big impact on our perception of space and proportion. And we need to be aware of that. I am sorry about this jiggling up and down. I was using a camera stand, which I don't use anymore, when I drew this. This was actually a drawing I did some years ago. And there are a few differences in this as to how I would do this today. But what is the same is my focus on seeing the shapes when I'm actually positioning the significant lines, especially the vertical or the, not the vertical, but the straight lines or the approximately straight lines. It is still meant to be a fairly brisk sketch, and as I said before, it will be finished with Sketchmarker, and I will show the Sketchmarker part as part of this video. And I would certainly, if I were doing this now, just tweak the contrast of the sketch markers. I'd make the darks a bit darker. So let me know in the comments if when we get to that you agree with me or not. So you'll see how with this staircase I'm actually drawing the effective detail with it. I'm not drawing the actual detail. I'm doing just some marks to indicate what's happening. And you can't necessarily track every rise and tread. But one interesting thing, just in terms of perspective and staircases, if you look at the staircase in the reference, we can see the treads, which are the horizontal parts, have the light coming on them more directly, and so forth, and therefore they're lighter. Well, you can see as you go up the stairs that the width of the tread, well, not the width, but the thickness, the apparent thickness from our view here decreases as we move further up. And we can see a wider white section at the bottom that becomes less, and then it's pretty much just almost a white line, and then it disappears. And then as we go higher up above eye level, because we see directly onto the edge of one of these steps, if there happens to be a step that lines up with eye level, and then above that, the actual rise, which is the vertical part, we start to see less and less of that because the step below it blocks our view of the base of the rise more and more as the steps go higher and higher above eye level. Now, you'll notice at this point that I'm just getting ready to put the markers on. So there's a little more of a gap here while I'm just finding the pens I'm going to use, the sketch markers, and making sure they've still got some ink in them. I'm using Copic sketch markers here, as I've used Copic multi-liners to do this. I'm using a 0.2 millimeter here, and I would have used a 0.3 for the closer parts, but I would have been better off, I think, if I'd switched to a 0.1, and that would have helped me with the final line, I think, draw the detail smaller. Scale is important. Scale is not so much a proportion problem with a particular part of the drawing, but it's having an element in one part of the drawing that's larger than it should be in relation to another part of the drawing that you've already drawn for the distance away that it is. We have proportion problems when it's a height to width ratio. So if my obelisk had been too fat for the height, then that's a proportion problem. If my obelisk is too large or too small in relation to the closer objects, that's a scale problem. Hope that is helpful if you've wondered what the differences are between the two. And now I'm doing this lamppost. And I'm not worried with all the inaccuracy of the curved parts, because if we look at our reference, I've already seen and worked out that, well, there's dark values behind it from the shadows within the foliage across the road. And I can use those to actually define my edge more carefully when I do the ink value over the top of that. And so I'm doing some of the darker elements first. Generally, as a rule, I like to do some of the darker parts first, but I usually hold back from doing them as dark as I think they're going to be, because I want to give myself the ability to fine-tune the relative values towards the end. It's very hard to judge the values in one part, particularly at the start of doing this values section, when there's so much white paper, because we judge the values against other values. And it's also easy, if we add the values just bit by bit, to opt for too many mid values. Now, that's okay if we want to have darker values, because we can always add darker ink over the top. But if we add too many mid values in the areas that actually want to have lighter values, that's a problem, because we can't make them any lighter. In that case, we need to explore the possibility, can we make the darker values darker still, because it's the relative difference, not the absolute difference. However, if we've already gone very dark at the start, if we've virtually gone black already, then we can't go any darker. And so now we're left with too much mid value, which can create, well, at the very least, some sort of, fairly boring sort of visual scene. But at the worst can become confusing because it can start to hide the different elements that we have. Using value, in fact, I would say manipulating the value that we have in our reference to create clarity is one of the great benefits of putting value onto our drawings. And it doesn't matter whether it's ink value, such as here, or whether it's hatching value, as I more commonly do, and as you've quite possibly seen in some of my other videos. If you do draw with ink, and if hatching is a problem, please check out my hatching playlist, because hatching is something I've really worked at understanding for myself over the last couple of years, and then actually choosing subjects that push my hatching understanding and technique, particularly Australian bushland ones, to try and create meaning but clarity in a tangled scene. And I think it's been a great help for me, and it has been, I know from some of the comments, for many others as well. So if hatching's a problem, but hatching's not a problem in this drawing because I'm not having to hatch. I'm using the sketch markers to create these very dark values. And it was because there was such dark, even values in this scene from the strong, almost overhead midday lighting that really made me decide to use the markers. I thought that part of the appeal of this scene was the relatively large, clean, geometric spaces, angles from this fairly extreme view. And I thought if I was going to start to do cross-hatching to get the values, and of course the shadows and the shade is an important part of the visual drama of this scene as well, that there just be too many lines and it would mess up what I would hope would be a fairly bold contrast between light and dark. Because if we want to create the effect of strong sunlight, and of course I can't draw sunlight, but I can draw the shade and shadows that strong sunlight casts, I actually control it by manipulating the darknesses. And so here I go. And again, I wasn't fussed with the messy inkwork on these posts for the line work, inkwork I mean, because I knew I'd be coming down over the top with a very heavy, very dark black ink effect. But you'll notice I haven't done the same thing at the top of the lamp because I'm going to use the light at the top to create the form. And so now I'm playing around with the values in that shrub at the back. So I'm using a range of sketch markers here. Just looking at it probably from an N3. This is the neutral grey colour. It's not overly warm or cool. They do have a grey that's warm and a grey that's cool. But I like the neutral grey because it sits a little bit in the middle. Just choosing another pen here. I've been a bit messy on that little part of the handrail. Well, not the actual handrail, but the concrete above the handrail down the bottom that's in nice bright sunlight. And just looking at that, that's the one where that center lamp goes through. And if you look at the shape of that, you can see how far out my drawing is compared to the angles that are on the one in the photo. And so this is what I mean when I say we see the shape and we try and draw the shape in our drawing that is the same, that the height to width proportions are the same and the angles are the same. And my one, if you like, the roughly vertical lines actually angle to the right way too much. If we look at the photo, that detail on the photo, we can see that, in fact, the roughly vertical line is closer to vertical than mine is. And what that does is it shifts the position of where it feels like we're viewing from. Because if we look at in the photo, we look straight down there and we see that detail, then I'm closer to it than I am in my drawing, where to get that angle, I have to move actually further to the right. And what that does is, in a small detail such as this, it may not visually create a distortion. And if everything else is in place, then we might get away with it. But if I have a lot of things like that where the angle isn't quite right, and the if you like, the distortion is different from problem area to problem area in terms of whether it goes left or right or too high or too low, then that starts to not collect together when we look at it to give a coherent view, but actually says, this is like a cartoon view. It doesn't actually make sense with reality. It's only when all of these angles and proportions and scale is consistent with the reference or with the reality in front of us that we actually start to get a scene that feels real, and it feels real, and therefore we don't even think about it. We don't usually look at something and think, oh, that feels like it's a realistic view. We're just immediately taken into the view. We don't want people to be conscious of, is this a realistic viewing position? Is there consistency in all the details that everything feels like we viewed it from the one spot? Well, we don't want that. We want people just to, wow, look at these stairs. I feel like I'm falling down them, or whatever. Or wow, it's such a hot, bright day. I can almost feel that heat. We want them to be responding to the visual realities that we've been trying to capture, the visual effects that we've been trying to capture. And see, even at this point, I could have corrected that obelisk I've talked about. I could have made it actually smaller and hidden the lines by emphasizing the darkness behind it more. And one problem with my drawing I really want to point out is that cactus-like shadow we have in the lower right section on the wall on the right-hand side of the stairs. If you look at the photo, you can see that it's more narrowed because we're looking along the wall fairly much. In my drawing, it looks as though we're looking at this little cactus man more front on because he's wider and the top of his head is rounder. In other words, it looks like we're viewing that shadow from a different location, moving now to the left-hand side more than the overall scene. And that problem down the bottom of the stairs of the sun on the top of the concrete above the rail, that made it look like we were viewing it more from the right-hand side. And so these are the inconsistencies that, if they get too strong or if they're of a more significant location, can really throw off our sense of this is a real scene. But I think that cactus shadow, for want of a better way of describing it, is actually significantly a more disturbing sort of visual aberration than the sunlit part further down on the left. What do you think? Always worth checking out our finished results and critiquing them, because that tells me, well, I need to pay more attention when I do the shadows and not thinking, oh, this is just the quick bit at the end. Every part needs to have the same deliberate intention. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I hope you found this helpful. Please check out my playlist to navigate all the content on my channel. But whatever you watch and whatever you draw and however you draw it and however it turns out, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time.